In this video, I'm going to show you how to start a shawl using what's called the garter stitch cast on. I've used it for many years and I really like it a lot because you can use it with pretty much any weight yarn, and you can determine the number of stitches that you want to start with. In this case, I start with 2 stitches, which you can see running along the edge of the shawl here, with a DK weight yarn. If I'm knitting a shawl with a fingering weight yarn, I usually start with 3 stitches because I want the edge to be a little bit thicker with a thinner weight yarn. And you can also see here that I use a simple yarn over increase along the edge as I'm growing the shawl out from this point, which I'll show you in a second. The reason for that is, for me personally, a yarn over increase is much easier to do and quicker than make one right, make one left increase, which is what I call a closed increase, which is what's on either side of this center stitch. Sometimes in shawls I've used a yarn over increase on either side of the center stitch. It's a design decision, but when I have a linear pattern like this, I tend to want to have a closed look along the center spine. And in your pattern, you'll see that I refer to the center stitch with the letter CS for center stitch. So when I start the garter tab cast on, I really wanted to show folks, especially beginner knitters, because when I've taught this in knitting classes, it can be a little tricky the first few times because it tends to twist around a little bit. So basically, you take your yarn that you'll be using to start your shawl and just make a slip knot, and I usually leave a few inches, maybe 3 inches, to make it easier to weave that end in when I'm done. As for needles, needle length, I have interchangeable needles, which I love. These are Addi Turbos, which I really love because they have the blunt tips, which I really prefer for quick knitting. Some knitters like pointy tips. It's kind of personal preference. Pointy tips are better if you're knitting a lot of lace. Makes it easier to pick up stitches. But for me, generally, I prefer interchangeables. And what this allows me to do is, it's a little hard to tell because I have the camera a certain distance here. I start with a shorter length, but if you're limited budget-wise, 32-inch length circulars work for most of my knitting. This one here is a 24-inch just because I have it attached to my number 7 tips. The bulk of the shawl will be knit on a 32-inch needle. When I increase to a lot of stitches, then I jump up to a 40-inch. Sometimes going to a 47 can be a little easier, but then you're moving the stitches around a lot. So a lot of it just comes with experience. Okay, so we have a slip knot, and I use the long tail cast on, but basically I'm just creating a second loop here, and then I'm just going to do a simple overhand knot to fasten this off. I don't like to go too knot crazy. Okay, so now I'm going to knit 6 rows, and this is where something very simple can get a little bit squirrely or tricky, because it can tend to twist around on you. So what I like to try and do is just take my time, and you think you're not going to lose count of 6 rows, but sometimes you can. I like to keep my tension taut, but not super tight. So there's 1. This will be 2. Now it's going to want to get loose, especially with metal needles. They can be somewhat slippery. If this is tricky for you on metal or with the circular cable, and I believe that was 3, you can also cast on with wooden double-pointed needles and then transfer your cast on to your circular needle if it's a little bit easier for you. Okay, so that was 3. 4, and it might look loosey-goosey, but at the end I kind of tamp down. 4, 5. Okay, I'm doing this a little faster than I normally would do if I'm starting a shawl, but this is for demonstration purposes. Okay, and then 6. Okay, so what this should yield is sort of a strange looking little rectangular squiggle. It's not really going to look like a perfect rectangle. Sorry, I'm looking at my knitting instead of the camera screen. You want your tail to be coming from the top left corner, and notice I turned my knitting from this direction to sideways, because what we're going to do is we're going to pick up 3 stitches along the long edge, and then we're going to fudge it and pick up 2 stitches along the short edge. So then we'll have 2 stitches, 3 stitches, and 2 stitches, which will give us 7. So usually what I do is I look at this top edge and I try and pick up the same loop on the top edge. Sometimes you could pick up, well, generally if I pick up this one in the front, it gets a little wonky in here. So I'm just going to go ahead and pick up what looks to be the most clear stitch, and then here I can also adjust my tension just to try and make everything even. So there's 1, then we will attempt to pick up the same loop on the next row down. That makes 2. You might feel like you're sort of pinching in a little, that's okay. Then this yarn here split a little bit, but it will even out. Sorry, I'm getting used to these new lights here. And this video is set up 3. Now this end here, it always looks a little bit different to me. I just generally, I think I'm going to go for this loop right here, and then this one next to it. So you want the knot to be in the back, and you want 2 stitches that are roughly on the end. There's 1, and then this one here is a separate loop. And this might look a little bit messy, but make sure we get that whole piece of yarn. This last one, I sort of am knitting with the very tips. Okay, so now I give it a little tug down, and it should look like a little bit of a, almost like a little clamshell. Okay, so then I flip my yarn, my knitting around rather, and this is where I'm going to put a marker. Now, I'm going to mark off, so these 2 stitches, this is the back side or the wrong side. The other side will be the front side or the right side. The 2 stitches on the end will be my selvage stitches. The next 2 stitches in are going to start to form the 2 sides of the triangular shawl, and the middle stitch will be the center stitch. Now, since I only like to use 1 marker before my center stitch, I would normally be putting a marker only here. But for beginners, you're probably going to want to have a marker on either side. So I will get 2 markers here, and I'll work with 2 just to show you how we get this thing going here. Okay, so in this shawl, the 2 selvage stitches are always knit in garter, so they're always knit. So I'm going to knit 2 stitches, and again, I'm keeping my tension fairly taut and even. Not too tight, because you need to be able to knit and slide the stitches off, but you don't want to be too loose on this part. Now, since the front of this shawl is knit in stockinette, this means on the back side I'm purling. So I bring my yarn to the front, and I'm going to purl my first stitch that's part of my triangle. Then I'm going to place a marker to set off my center stitch. Then I'm going to purl my center stitch. Then I will place 1 more marker, so I have 1 on each side of my center stitch. Then I'm going to purl the next stitch, and then I'm going to bring the yarn to the front to knit my last 2 stitches in garter. And again, I'm keeping my tension fairly taut. Give it a little tug down, we'll flip it. Okay. So now, using the same yarn for this project, I'm going to do my first increase row. Now in this triangular shawl, the increases are only on the front or the right side. They are going to be after each and before each of the 2 selvage stitches, and then on either side of the center stitch. The 2 increases on the outside will be yarn overs, and the 2 stitches on either side of the center stitch will be a make one right and a make one left. Okay, so here we go. So we're going to knit 2. And again, you don't want your tension on this first stitch especially to be too loose, but you can always tighten it up when you bring the yarn around for your second stitch. Okay, and a yarn over. And the reason I use yarn overs on the outside is from experience I've noticed that when shawls stretch, that yarn over closes up pretty well and you're not going to read it as a whole. Okay, knit the first stitch. Now my make one right, I bring my left hand tip from behind, bring it up through the bottom. So I'm going from back to front, and then I'm going to knit into the front. So however beginner knitters want to make a little rhyme in their head to remember that, it's a personal way to figure that out. Slip my marker, knit my center stitch, slip my second marker, and then the increase on this side is a make one left. So I take the left tip and I go front to back, and then I'm going to knit into the back. And again, with these blunt addies, especially at the beginning, it can be a little tricky. But as your rows get longer, you're doing fewer increases and it goes faster. And I'm going to knit this single stitch, yarn over, knit 2, give it a little tug to even out my tension, flip it. Okay, and on the back side, I'm going to knit the first 2 and the last 2, and everything in the middle gets purled. So this is working across the back row on this shawl. In some shawls, you'll increase on the back side on the edges to make a wider triangle, but in this shawl, we're not doing that because the proportions are just fine to simply do 4 increases on the front rows. So slip my marker, purl. Okay, then coming up, I will show you how to attach your stripe color. Oops. Bring the yarn to the front for the 2 garter stitches on the end. Okay, and then we'll flip it. And you can see that this is creating a, well, it might look like a semicircle now, but it's actually going to be a triangle. Okay, so now to start our contrast stripe, it's very simple. You just take your new yarn, and I like to attach it or tie it on while my stitches are on the needle as opposed to on the cable, otherwise this stitch is going to be too skinny. And I don't fuss too much about making this join or not perfect, because usually what I'll do once I get a few rows knit, I'll come back and I'll gently unpick this simple knot and re-knot it closer to my knitting. Because generally what happens, and this is hard to do up in the air, usually I do this resting on the surface, but I try and get this knot as close as I can to my knitting. And this might be a tad short. I might make it a little longer for weaving that end in, but I just want to get this going to show you. Then I let the main color yarn hang, and I'm going to work with my contrast color, and I'm going to follow the same pattern. Sometimes that tail wants to jump up in there. I'm going to knit the first 2, do a yarn over, then I'm going to knit to my first marker, which in this case is 3 stitches. Then I'm going to make one right, which means I'm lifting from the back to the front my main color. I put my index on the back to keep that from slipping off. Then I'm going to knit into the front with my contrast color, slip it off, slip my marker, knit the center stitch, slip my marker, make one left, so from front to back through the main color, knit into the back of this stitch. That's why you don't want to be knitting too tight. There's our increase, knit across to the last 2 stitches, yarn over, knit 2. Oops. Okay, then we flip it and we work our way across a wrong side row, which is basically knitting the 2 end stitches, purling across. When you purl or knit into your yarn overs, actually you'll be purling into them. You might want to tighten up your tension just a little bit. In general, I would say this beginning of your shawl, you may want to knit a tad tighter than you'll knit the rest of the shawl, just to give it a little bit of stability. Then once you get into the body of the shawl, you can loosen up your tension a tiny bit. Okay, we just purled across to the last 2 and we knit, and I wanted to show you how you simply carry your yarn up the side so that you don't have a million ends to weave in, which would be silly with a 2-2 stripe. When we get to the wider stripes at the end, where we're knitting 8 row stripes instead of 2 row stripes, sorry, I'm trying to look at my knitting and the camera, then I will cut the yarn and tie it, but there are only 4 wide stripes, so there aren't a crazy number of ends to weave in. Okay, so what I do is I bring, I call it the old yarn, to the back, and I lift up the new yarn or the next yarn in my right hand, and I just simply begin to knit with that yarn. Now you won't be able to see it right away, but I'll try and show you how much slack I leave here. Here's the old yarn. You'll see it on the back. Sometimes I give a little tug. You don't want the yarn that you're carrying up along the side, we need to do our yarn over, to be too tight, because you don't want that side to pucker, and you work your way across the row. But let me show you on the shawl I have established that I'm working, oops, sorry, on the ruffle. You can see the tension along the row where I carry the yarn up. So if I give this a tug, you can see that it still has a give to it, but the yarn carrying, it really only puckers if there's absolutely no tension on this edge of the shawl, which would hardly ever happen. So if you look at the entire shawl, once it's blocked or used a little bit, this all lays fairly flat. And then this side here has no yarn carrying, but it really pretty much disappears while you're wearing the shawl. So that is the garter tab cast on. I hope that helped people who are new to it, and it really is a wonderful way to start a lot of different types of shawls with any weight yarn. Okay.